Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Joining Diana today is Noel Coakley. Noel is a psychotherapist, meditation teacher, and former elementary school special educator. He has studied Tibetan Buddhism since 1997 and the Bon tradition since 2013. Noel is a director of the Boston Center for Contemplative Practice and assistant director at Dharma Moon. Today, Noel and Diana will be discussing the role of Buddhism in psychotherapy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Noel. I'm going to pass the conversation to Diana.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Noel, for joining me today. I am very curious about the coordination between psychotherapy and meditation. The studies are really clear that meditation is a helpful antidote to anxiety and all of the things that we go to psychotherapy for. But I would love to understand more about how you bring that into an office. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for the work that you all do. You're doing wonderful things in the world. So I appreciate you all. Appreciate what you do.
Thank you. So let's talk about Buddhism. You have been a Buddhist for 26 years at this point?
Something like that. Yeah. First introduction was in high school, something like that. Well, we just listened to some nice music before this. And actually that was my introduction to Buddhism through hearing some music. I don't know if you remember in the early 90s or mid 90s, the Beastie Boys used to put on concerts in New York. Yeah. The Tibetan Freedom concerts.
Yeah.
And they put out an album one year recording a bunch of the different artists that played on that. And in the beginning and the end, they were opening and closing prayers from the monks and the lamas. And then they had some traditional artists. One of them was Yungchen Yamo, and she sung the Om Mani Padme Hum prayer. It's a prayer for compassion and love. I had never heard it before. I was like, what is this woman singing about? Like, there was something immediately connective about it. It's a really beautiful version of it. But she just teed it up with, this is a song about love and compassion. Compassion is wishing for people not to suffer. Love is wishing for people to be happy. This is a prayer for that. It's like, that's what these prayers are about. This is amazing. Like, and then there was just so much in, maybe sad, it may be happy. It was something familiar, but I had no idea what she was saying. So that kind of started, what is this about? Where does this come from? What is this context? And that just kicked it off. So it was a musical start to all that.
I love that. It was like the music reached in and grabbed your heart, and then you had to follow it. Yeah.
Yeah, as it does, right? I think we all connect to music in that way, one way or another. And that's something beautiful about one prayer is musical. So there was something that grabbed me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then how did that morph from being grabbed at the Beastie Boys and and being where you are today? What was the evolution of that?
Yeah, slow and over time and still evolving for sure. I still feel like a beginner in so many ways. But so I was in high school, hadn't really been introduced. I grew up Irish Catholic culturally, more so than spiritually, and grew up going to church or something like that, but it didn't really catch on for me in that sense. So most of it was reading. I didn't have teachers in that tradition immediately available that I was aware of. I did go see the Dalai Lama speak at one point in high school, about a year after I had heard that. And that was, had a major impact. And despite being a stadium full of people, it was like he was talking to everybody individually. It was amazing. And so that just really kept fueling the fire. And I was meditating on my own, best I knew how, for a number of years until just about after college. I connected with the first Lama I had connected with, Lama Sarang Nodop. And he's a chaplain at Beth Israel now in Boston. And he was running at the time a store, like a Buddhist Tibetan store on Mass Ave in Cambridge, and would teach in the back. Would have Sunday groups and teach. That was the first time I connected to a Lama, a real teacher, and And really, in a lot of ways, I still wasn't ready to hear what I was being told, but it was planting seeds. And it was also him as a person was an example of a way of being in the world that was as much the teaching than anything particular that he even said, in terms of the concrete content of the teaching, just watching this person be in the world. And he left because the store went under because he would give us stuff every time we went in there. It's okay. I'm failed at retail, but I'm gonna stick with the Dharma teaching, and he's kept with that, and we've remained friends, and he's remained one of my teachers. I actually just got to catch up with him the other day. That kicked it off, and it from there it intertwined with my career. Started as a school teacher, but it became clear that it was the relational piece of that I was really connected to, and so educationally, professionally, that moved on to learning the psychotherapy piece. So I'm learning the Tibetan Buddhism at the same time I'm learning psychotherapy. At the same time I'm learning the yoga tradition, reconnecting with my body. At the same time, I'm a client in my own therapy, meeting people who have now become significant relationships. One of whom is my wife now. So all of these things, right? That whole mix in terms of the healing process kicking off and going over time. And since then, I've had the luck of connecting to a number of teachers, especially from running the center that I ran in Newton for about 7 years. A lot of teachers came through there, and I was connected to a few of them very closely. And through those connections and through those teachers, I was connected to the Yungdrung Bön tradition, which is one of the 5 major schools.
One sec. What is that? What is it?
Yeah. So some would say from that tradition that it's not Buddhism, and others would say it is another school of Buddhism. It's very mixed with Nyingma Buddhism, one of the major schools of Buddhism. But Yungdrung Bön is the full name. Means something like everlasting truth or everlasting Dharma. Pre-existed before Indian Buddhism came to Tibet. Before it was even Tibet, it was a kingdom that stretched all the way from where Tibet and Nepal is now, all the way through the Middle East. So it stretched the whole way across. It was huge. It was called Zhangzhung. And so Bön existed then and has existed through. And somewhere, the waters mixed with that and Nyingma Buddhism, Nyingma Dzogchen. And I'm not scholarly enough to tell the difference, but I'm told that somewhere they connected and they're now very, very similar. One of the major differences, however, from the Yungdrung Bön tradition is a whole side that a lot of it looks like the rest of Buddhism looks, but then there's a whole, almost like a shamanistic side to it, that again has deeper roots, similar to different shamanistic practices you'd see from all sorts of other traditions. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a little bit of a broader spectrum in that sense, is my understanding. I've just been, I found myself most connected, probably because of the particular teachers I've connected with in that lineage. And I find that there's a lot of generosity for teaching in that lineage. Sometimes what happens is there's a little bit more tightness, a little bit playing it closer before things are shared, which I understand. I think a lot of the stuff comes from refugee culture, so it's protected. And, people were carrying books out of burning monasteries on their backs and are protective about it and don't want it to get misused. So I can understand that. But it seems that across the board, the Bön are very generous and quick to teach things. So I feel lucky in that sense.
And are they still called lamas?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So what does the lama actually mean? Teacher? Or
a lama? Yeah, that means someone who's dedicated their life to teaching Dharma, right? And there's lama, and then
Dharma
there's also Dharma. You can use that word a lot of different ways. Often it means the specific teachings of Buddhism. More broadly, it could mean the truth or the path or the way. So you could even say, like, what's the Dharma of using a screwdriver? That's like, okay, this is how you use a screwdriver. You know what I mean? So you could use it even in that sort of everyday sense of truth. Mm-hmm. Or use it in an ultimate way, like this is the nature of reality, and this is interdependence, and this is what is not the deluded mind. So you can use that word in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were going to talk to psychotherapists in their lingo in this moment,
Yeah.
where would you call the overlap between your practice in Buddhism and psychotherapeutic technique?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the development of awareness and awareness practices. If someone comes into therapy and there's something they're looking to understand themselves, they're looking to understand their patterns, they're looking to make a change. Maybe they know what change they want to make already. I find it really hard to do that without developing some sense of awareness around those things. So and on the spot awareness, not just retrospective awareness. Like I can tell you what happened yesterday, but how do we learn to watch what's happening right now in our mind? So I think that's the first major overlap. Is part of that awareness comes from talking about it and talk about, well, hey, what's happening for you right now? Right? We can do that by talking together. We can do that by, in a sense, I think we can think of therapy as a co-meditation. Maybe the awareness is not there for everybody sitting together. So one person's holding that awareness and just reflecting things back. And then it helps somebody develop that awareness. But then you can teach specific practices like mindfulness practice, where someone is, yes, you're developing concentration, but maybe more importantly, we're developing a sense of awareness, the ability to watch the mind, whatever it's up to. And then we can watch it not just on gross level, this is the immediate thought or the immediate top level feeling state I'm having, but then more and more subtle, like what's behind that thought? What's the underlying belief behind that thought? Where's that even coming from? And learn to watch that on the fly as it's happening. And now we've got choices. Now
Well,
we've
where
got,
does self-compassion come in those moments of awareness? Just curious. I can imagine being aware of behavior and patterns and all of these things that you're interested in changing and feeling overwhelmed by the frequency, being overwhelmed by that feeling of useless,
yeah,
sloth, whatever the issue might be. Yeah.
yeah. Well, what you're naming first off, I think when we bring that awareness on, a lot of times people do feel overwhelmed because it almost feels like things speed up or increase, even though it's really just we're becoming aware of how much is actually happening in there and how much is going on without our awareness and having an effect on us. So sometimes at first it can be overwhelming, and so we do it slow by slow, and we have to start with this attitude of compassion of, okay, there's a cause and effect for all this. I didn't pick these patterns. They developed over time. I can come to understand what those reasons are. But we've got to start with forgiving ourselves for being confused, and then the other thing mindfulness can help with is that internal relationship. And I think this is the crossover as well. Like we have a thought, we have a direct experience, and there's a way we automatically talk to ourselves about that, for better or worse. A lot of us are pretty self-critical, and there's a lot of the survival mind stuff going on that keeps us focused on, where are the deficits, where are the problems, where are the threats. That's kept us alive for a long time. So that automatic tendency, which can be ramped up more or less for different folks. And then if on top of that, you've had really dangerous situations that you've experienced in your life, of course, that's going to be ramped up even more. Right. So learning to watch how that happens, watch how we speak to ourselves, watch how we predict the future, watch how we drag up the past, and learn to develop a relationship almost like you're splitting yourself. Like your direct experience is like a young version of you or something. It's like reparenting yourself. And then you watch the way there's an automatic cognition, automatic thinking mind voice that relates and parents that child. And maybe that's going well, and maybe I remember hearing someone ask, like, if you could take that voice in your head out and sit them across the table, how long would you last on a date?
Right.
So it's like we got to renegotiate that relationship, and first we got to watch it and go, okay, this is how this goes, and this is when it's supportive, and this is when it's not, and these are the automatic things. And even just that watching is a different way of being with that. Like, no, I see you. But even just the being seen piece, witnessing our own experience, the felt sense of being seen. and then tuning in,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so not just being seen. So now I'm talking about like Western attachment ingredients. If we use this language, like what are the good ingredients of a strong sense of self? So we've got safety and security, number one.
Mm-hmm.
So we can respond to ourselves by saying, I'm going to keep you safe. I'm going to watch and not get you into dangerous territory. And then we can pay attention. A lot of times we're too lost in thought and not paying attention to what our body's feeling, not paying attention to what we're thinking. And then tuning in even more closely, dialed in, like a real subtle, sensitive level of like, I see how you're feeling,
Mm-hmm.
and then even giving and empowering that with agency. Like, I see that you're upset and I'm going to do something about that. Like that has power in the world versus learned helplessness. Right. So that can be with somebody else, or that can be responding to us. I see that I'm tired. I see that I'm anxious. I see that I'm hungry. I'll actually do something about that rather than like, well, too bad I got to work or something,
Mm.
And then beyond that, just allowing us to be ourselves, unobscured, unobstructed, or like unconditional love. Right. So not you have to be this way or you have to be that way to be okay, to be good enough, to be acceptable, or this moment is not the way you should be. So even in our mindfulness practice, just watching your own experience, you can be practicing all those ingredients, and then in your day to day, we can be practicing like, okay, can I be talking to myself about that? That doesn't mean I have to be feeling good all the time.
Mm-mm.
But can I bring that attunement and that awareness and that like this is okay and you don't have to be another way and like I'm here with you. Whether or not we've received that from others, we can rewire that.
Absolutely. Have you ever studied any of the internal family systems model? There is something about what you're saying that strikes me as very consistent with that as well. Making friends with the parts basically, and
Yeah.
then observing them. I can see that.
Totally. Those IFS and meditation go really nicely hand in hand. There's a teacher, he's local to Boston, named John McCransky, who worked with the guy who put together the IFS framework, and they've married these two and done a lot of writing about it, and they speak really eloquently about that. They're both good resources for that. But they talk about exactly that. So let's say I'm familiar with that idea of what are my parts. Then we combine that with the awareness practice. You can actually watch that meeting on the fly rather than the
Right.
post-game analysis.
Right.
You can go, oh, look who's here. I know what he wants and needs and how he operates, and I know what he wants and needs and how they operate. And there's some more awareness to how we negotiate that relationship rather than it goes autopilot, maybe not in a healthy way.
Right. So we have spent 20 minutes. Tell me what I did not ask you. What would you like our audience to know that I didn't poke at?
Well, another, crossover and connection, I think that's relevant is the framework around trauma, and if we look at trauma as a disconnection that occurs to ourselves, to our experience, an adaptive disconnection that may have occurred because of things we've experienced, not knowing how else to process that, knowing how to regulate that, not having others hold that for us in a way that models it. The disconnection that occurs is what we can think about as the trauma really itself, right? And there's an explanation that I love that Gabor Mate plays out, this dilemma of two survival imperatives as a young child, where we have to be attuned to ourselves, we have to trust ourselves, like this is dangerous, I'm hungry, don't go that way, right? Just to be able to listen to our body and stay attuned to that. That's one survival imperative. And the other being maintaining the relationship with caregivers, right? Like the longest for humans out of any animals. We got to keep that intact. And if they're pit against each other, the maintaining of the relationship generally wins out. So we'll disconnect to ourselves or suppress ourselves if there's some conditionality in that relationship or love that doesn't allow us to be our whole self, or doesn't allow certain aspects of our experience, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, so the ways we can look at healing that, if trauma is disconnection, then healing is connection, remaining connected, not continuing that conditionality on our way of being and feeling like we got to stay disconnected. So one of the ways we can reconnect with ourselves is something like meditation practice, or embodied practices like a yoga practice, or any kind of physical activity where you're connecting body and mind. You know, you can certainly engage in physical activity and remain disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
But you can practice that in any of those spaces. And so learning to reconnect, not cut out any parts, not leave anybody out of the meeting, you know, not replay that conditional pattern. You know, this is healing from trauma, you know, because we're not changing the past events, but there's a internal relationship that's kicked off in a patterned way as a result of those things, right? That's the piece that we could change.
And a freedom
Yeah.
that comes with that. Yeah.
With changing that pattern, you mean? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're not limited by that conditionality anymore.
Mm-mm.
You know?
Mm-mm.
You know, the other thing, I think it's interrelated with that, and this is where I think Buddhism and psychotherapy overlap, but also disconnect it. You know, Western psychotherapy is good about building the strong sense of self. You know, I know who I am. I'm this, in a solid, in a healthy. There's a certain healthy amount of that. But then also somewhere where Buddhism comes in, it names, you know, that grasping onto a solid sense of self, which is actually unfindable and always changeable. Like when body changes, the mind changes, our relationship. There's nothing that stays. It names that clinging and holding on is actually the center of all suffering. So somewhere, but also to jump into that and recognize, like, well, the self is not that solid, is somewhat dangerous and unhealthy to do without a solid sense of self already in a healthy developmental way.
Correct.
Right. So that piece got the healthy sense of self, like independent. I'm good on that. Then you can move into the other piece. And that, from the Buddhist perspective, that separate self is usually built on that conditionality that we learn over time in those patterns. Also, in that Buddhist sense of self is the idea of Buddha nature, bodhicitta. It's like original goodness, in other words, like the idea that you and I and everyone is a Buddha. The variables, we don't realize that, and Buddha is not some like godlike thing, or the idea we have about that. It's just a human flourishing on all cylinders, as all humans can do when it's unobstructed. Right. So the qualities of like love and patience and compassion and spaciousness and all these things that are our nature, but then they got clouded over lifetime, you know, maybe many lifetimes or generations. So it's the idea that like that's always there, always right here.
That core.
Is it clouded over? Or is it not clouded over? We don't even have to develop those things. We just have to sort of learn how to get out of the way of them. Right. And the way that we learn the conditional love is one of the major obscurations. You know, when you learn, oh, if I'm like this around people, they're loving to me. So we get this idea that like I get love from them, or I don't get love from them. When the reality is your love remains less obscured in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's allowed to flourish rather than anybody has that to give. So if we no longer are tied into the idea that I need to get that outside, then I'm also no longer tied down to the idea of like keep being that conditional self that has to get it the way I think I have to get it.
The dance, as I call it, the people-pleasing dance, you know.
Yeah. Or on the darker side, like protecting so it doesn't get taken or it's not dangerous or something, you know. So all those, that's usually the self we identify as the one that does the dance, as you said, and not identify with what maybe is underneath that cloud, perhaps. You know, you don't have to stop the dance. We just have to see that it's always right here. So sometimes there are practices that help us refamiliarize with the loving qualities of awareness that help us get back in touch with, and then refamiliarize ourselves, not build, because it's always here, can't be messed with, but refamiliarize ourselves with that nature. And then you learn, when you get a felt sense of that now and again, you see like, oh, there's a thought that if I go with that would take me off of that idea. Or there's, and you don't have to stop them. You just don't take the bait,
Exactly. Well, Noel, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. It makes me want to employ more mindfulness and pay better attention. It does. So
thank you.
If that was your goal.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.